Picture this. It's August of 480 BC, and you're standing in a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. The sun is rising over the Aegean Sea behind you, painting the rocky cliffs blood red. In front of you stretches the largest army the world has ever seen, 2 million men, according to the ancient sources. Modern historians argue it was closer to 300,000, but even that conservative estimate means you're facing odds of 1,000 to 1. You're a Spartan Hoplite, and there are only 300 of you. You should be terrified. You should be running. But you're not, because standing beside you is King Leonidas, and behind you is everything you've ever known. Your wife, your children, your home. The narrow pass at Thermopylae is the gateway to all of Greece, and if you step aside, the Persian Empire will swallow your entire civilization. So you plant your feet, you lock your shield with your brothers, and you prepare to show the greatest empire on earth why Sparta doesn't surrender. This is the story of how 300 Spartans and 7,000 Greek allies held back an empire for 7 days. This is the story of the battle that created a legend that inspired every underdog story for the next 2,500 years. This is the story of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, where a small group of free men stood against tyranny and taught the world that courage is contagious. Before diving into this forgotten chapter of human resilience, if you enjoy learning about the battles that shaped our world, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the moments that defined Western civilization. Now, wipe the sweat from your brow and look at what's coming for you across the plain. To understand why you should be absolutely terrified, you need to understand what the Persian Empire represented in 480 BC. This wasn't just another kingdom. It was the superpower of the ancient world, stretching from India to Egypt, from the shores of the Black Sea to the deserts of Arabia. It covered 2 million square miles and ruled over 40% of the world's population. To put that in perspective, the entire Greek world, all the city-states combined, could fit inside a single Persian province. The man who commanded this empire was Xerxes, the king of kings, the Shah of shahs, the ruler of rulers. He sat on a golden throne in Persepolis, and when he spoke, 50 nations listened. His father, Darius the Great, had built this empire into a machine of conquest. But 10 years earlier, in 490 BC, something shocking had happened. A tiny Greek city called Athens had defeated a Persian invasion force at Marathon. 26,000 Persians had faced 10,000 Athenians on a beach, and the Athenians had won. Darius never got over that humiliation. He spent the rest of his life planning revenge, gathering the largest invasion force in human history. But he died before he could use it. Now his son Xerxes had inherited both the throne and the vendetta. This wasn't about conquest anymore. This was personal. Xerxes wanted to erase Greece from the map. He wanted to burn Athens to the ground. He wanted every Greek to understand that defying the Persian Empire was a death sentence. The preparations took 4 years. Xerxes assembled an army so large that ancient historians claimed it drank rivers dry when it stopped to water. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Asia and Europe, so his army could walk from one continent to another. When a storm destroyed his bridge, Xerxes was so enraged that he ordered his soldiers to whip the sea 300 times and throw chains into the water to symbolically enslave it. This was the mind you were dealing with. A god-king who believed the laws of nature, bent to his will. The core of this massive army was the Immortals, 10,000 elite Persian warriors who got their name from a terrifying practice. Whenever one of them fell in battle, he was immediately replaced, so the unit always numbered exactly 10,000. They were the emperor's bodyguard, the finest soldiers in the empire, armed with spears, bows, and wicker shields. They wore scale armor that glittered like fish scales in the sun, and their discipline was legendary. But they were just the tip of the spear. Behind the Immortals came warriors from every corner of the empire, Medes in leather and felt, Indians with cotton armor and cane bows, Ethiopians in leopard skins carrying stone-tipped arrows, Thracians with foxskin caps and javelins, Arabians with long flowing robes and recurved bows. The Greek historian Herodotus, who documented this invasion in meticulous detail, counted 46 different nations marching under the Persian banner. It was a rainbow of conquest, every color representing a people who had learned to kneel. This army didn't just march to war. It built as it moved. Xerxes had engineers dig a canal through the peninsula of Athos to avoid sailing around it. Why risk losing ships in a storm when you could just cut through a mountain? It was an engineering project that took 3 years and involved thousands of workers. It was a message to the Greeks that the Persian Empire could reshape geography itself. The Persian fleet matched the army's scale, 1,200 warships, according to the ancient accounts. These were triremes, sleek fighting ships, powered by 3 banks of oars and 170 rowers each. They were designed to ram enemy vessels, to splinter hulls, and send sailors into the sea. The Persians had learned from their defeat at Marathon. This time, they weren't just bringing an army, they were bringing overwhelming force from land and sea simultaneously. When news of this approaching doom reached Greece, in the spring of 480 BC, panic spread like wildfire. The Greek city-states were not a unified nation. They were fiercely independent, constantly fighting each other, viewing their neighbors with suspicion. Athens and Sparta, the 2 most powerful cities, had been rivals for generations. Getting Greeks to agree on anything was like herding cats. Getting them to agree to fight together seemed impossible. But the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred religious site in Greece, issued a prophecy that chilled everyone who heard it. The priestess, speaking in the voice of Apollo, told the Athenians that their city would burn. She told them to flee to the ends of the earth, because nothing could save them. She spoke of wooden walls and divine wind, of blood and fire and death. It was the kind of prophecy that breaks a people's will. Athens was ready to surrender. Why fight when the gods themselves said you would lose? But one man refused to accept defeat. Themistocles, an Athenian politician and naval genius, interpreted the prophecy differently. He argued that the wooden walls meant ships, not city walls. He convinced Athens to evacuate the civilian population and trust their survival to their navy. It was a radical idea, abandoning your city to save your people, but desperation makes radicals of us all. While Athens debated prophecies, Sparta made a calculation. The Spartans were the finest warriors in Greece, bred from birth for one purpose: war. Every Spartan boy was taken from his mother at age 7 and thrown into the agoge, a brutal training program that killed the weak and turned the strong into living weapons. By the time a Spartan earned his red cloak and shield at age 20, he could march 50 miles in full armor, fight in formation for hours, and die without complaint. But Sparta had a problem. They were celebrating a religious festival called the Carneia when the Persian invasion began. Spartan law forbade military campaigns during holy days. The priests said marching to war during the festival would anger the gods. Most cities would have ignored the priests in the face of an existential threat, but Sparta was not most cities. They lived by their laws, even when those laws seemed suicidal. King Leonidas, one of Sparta's 2 hereditary kings, found a loophole. He couldn't take the full Spartan army north during the festival, but he could take his personal bodyguard. 300 men, all of them fathers with living sons, all of them elite warriors chosen from the cream of Spartan society. The requirement that they have living sons wasn't random. It was a death sentence written into the selection criteria. Leonidas was choosing men whose bloodlines would continue even after they fell. These 300 Spartans weren't going north to win. They were going north to buy time. The plan was simple and brutal. Hold the Persians at Thermopylae, the narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, until the main Greek army could assemble after the religious festivals ended. Make the Persians bleed for every inch of ground. Show them that conquering Greece wouldn't be a walk in the park. Thermopylae means hot gates in Greek, named for the thermal springs that bubbled up from the rocks. It was the perfect place for a last stand. The pass was only 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, hemmed in by sheer cliffs on one side and the sea on the other. A 1,000,000-man army couldn't use its numbers in a space that tight. They would have to attack in waves, and waves could be broken. Leonidas marched north with his 300 Spartans and picked up allies along the way. 700 Thespians joined him, their entire military-age male population. 400 Thebans, though their loyalty was suspect. 1,000 Phocians to guard the mountain path. By the time Leonidas reached Thermopylae, he commanded approximately 7,000 men. It was still laughably small compared to what was coming, but it was enough to hold a narrow pass. When the vanguard of the Persian army arrived and saw the Greek position, they laughed. Their scouts reported that the Spartans were exercising and combing their long hair. The Persians thought this was the behavior of fools, preening before their execution. They didn't understand that this was a Spartan ritual before battle. The Spartans were preparing to die beautifully. Xerxes, confident in his overwhelming numbers, waited. He gave the Greeks 4 days to abandon the pass and surrender, 4 days to come to their senses and kneel. He couldn't believe these idiots would actually fight. When the 4 days expired and the Greeks were still standing there, shields locked and spears ready, Xerxes sent an envoy with a final message: surrender your weapons. Leonidas sent back 2 words that echo through history: molon lebe, come and take them. The trap was set. The architect had finished his design. All that remained was for the empire to step inside. When you're standing in that phalanx, locked shield to shield with your brothers, you need to understand the weapon you've become. The Greek phalanx wasn't just a military formation. It was a philosophy made flesh. Every hoplite carried the same equipment: a round bronze shield called an aspis, 3 feet across and weighing 15 pounds. The shield protected your left side and half of the man standing to your right. His shield protected half of you. You lived or died together. There was no individual glory in the phalanx. There was only the line. Your primary weapon was the dory, an 8-foot spear with an iron leaf-shaped blade on one end and a bronze spike on the other. The spike served 2 purposes. It balanced the spear, and if the iron tip broke, you could flip the weapon and keep fighting. Strapped to your left arm was that massive shield, and on your right hip hung a backup weapon, the xiphos, a short double-edged sword for close-quarters butchery. Your armor marked you as a citizen soldier, a man wealthy enough to afford his own equipment. The Spartans wore bronze breastplates molded to look like muscled torsos. Bronze greaves protected their shins. A bronze helmet with a horsehair plume covered their heads, leaving only their eyes, nose, and mouth exposed. The total weight of this panoply was about 70 pounds. You didn't ride into battle wearing this, you marched. And the march itself was a weapon? The Spartans advanced to the sound of flutes. Not war drums or trumpets, but haunting, melodic flutes. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. While other armies screamed and shouted to build courage, the Spartans moved in eerie silence, their shields overlapping like the scales of a bronze serpent, flutes echoing off the rocks. It said, "We don't need to shout. We don't need to hype ourselves up. We are death, and death is patient." The Persian army that approached Thermopylae had never faced anything like this. Persian tactics relied on mobility and archery. Their warriors wore lighter armor, carried wicker shields, and preferred to shower the enemy with arrows before closing for melee. It worked brilliantly on open ground where they could maneuver. But Thermopylae wasn't open ground. It was a meat grinder, designed by the gods themselves. On the morning of the first attack, Xerxes sent in the Medes and Scythians, subject peoples from the Iranian plateau. These weren't his best troops. He was testing the Greeks, probing their defenses, expecting them to break and run when they saw the size of the force arrayed against them. 10,000 men funneled into that narrow pass, shoulder to shoulder, moving toward the Greek line. The Greeks waited. They didn't charge forward. They didn't waste energy. They stood like a bronze wall, spears angled forward, shields locked tight. When the Persians got within 50 yards, their archers began loosing arrows. Thousands of shafts darkened the sky, a black cloud of death hissing through the air. A Spartan warrior named Dionysus reportedly made a joke that survived 2,500 years. When someone warned him that the Persian arrows would block out the sun, he replied, "Good. Then we'll fight in the shade." That's the Spartan mind. Even death is just another detail to work around. The arrows clattered off the bronze shields and armor. Some found gaps, punching through into flesh, but the phalanx held. The wounded men were pulled back, fresh warriors stepped forward, and the line remained unbroken. Then the Medes hit the shield wall. What followed wasn't a battle. It was industrial slaughter. The Persians crashed into the Greek line like waves hitting a cliff. The first rank of Medes pushed forward with their short spears, trying to find gaps in the bronze wall. The Greeks thrust their longer spears over and around their shields, stabbing down into faces, throats, and chests. The range advantage was devastating. A Greek hoplite could kill a Persian before the Persian could even touch him. The men in the front rank of the phalanx bore the worst of it. They killed until their arms went numb, until their spears shattered, until they drew their swords and hacked at anything that came within reach. But behind them stood 7 more ranks of warriors, pushing forward, adding their weight to the line, ready to step over bodies and take the place of the fallen. The narrowness of the pass meant the Persians couldn't surround the Greeks. They couldn't use their numbers. Only the men in the very front could fight, and those men died. Fast. The Medes pushed and shoved and stabbed, and the Greeks pushed back harder. Bodies began piling up in front of the Greek line, creating a rampart of the dead that the next wave had to climb over. The battlefield became a horror show. Blood turned the ground into mud. Men slipped on their own intestines. The screaming was constant, a wall of sound that merged with the clash of bronze on bronze. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of blood, shit, and fear. This is what war actually looks like when you strip away the poetry. After hours of this meat grinder, the Medes broke. They couldn't take it anymore. They turned and ran, trampling their own comrades in their desperation to escape the bronze wall that wouldn't die. Xerxes watched from his golden throne on a hillside overlooking the pass. Ancient sources say he leaped from his seat 3 times during the battle, terrified that his army was being destroyed. The king sent in his second wave. Fresh troops, this time the Scythians, fierce warriors from the mountains of Persia. They charged into the pass with renewed fury, stepping over the bodies of the Medes, determined to succeed where their predecessors had failed. The result was exactly the same. The Greek line bent, but never broke. The longer spears killed at a distance the Persians couldn't match. The bronze armor absorbed blows that would have killed lighter armored men. The discipline of the phalanx held against the fury of the charge. By sunset of the first day, the ground in front of the Greek position was carpeted with Persian dead. Thousands of bodies lay twisted in the narrow pass, and not a single Persian had broken through. The Greeks had lost men, yes, but nothing compared to the slaughter they'd inflicted. The math was simple and brutal. For every Greek who fell, 10 Persians fell with him. That night, in the Persian camp, the mood was confusion and disbelief. These were warriors who had conquered the known world. They'd crushed armies in Egypt, Babylon, and India. They'd never encountered resistance like this. The Greeks weren't just fighting. They were dominating. Xerxes called a council of war. His generals argued over what to do. Some suggested building a road around the pass, but that would take weeks. Others proposed bringing up siege equipment, but you can't siege a phalanx. The pass was too narrow for siege towers, and the Greeks could simply retreat if threatened. The emperor of the world, the man who'd whipped the ocean itself, was stuck. On the Greek side, the mood was cautiously optimistic. They'd held for 1 day. 6 more days, and the main Greek army would arrive. 6 more days of holding this line, and Greece would have a fighting chance. Leonidas walked among his men that night, checking wounds, offering quiet words of encouragement. He knew what tomorrow would bring. More waves, more death, more testing of their resolve. The Spartans cleaned their weapons and combed their hair again. They tended to the wounded. They ate a simple meal of barley bread and wine. And then they slept the sleep of men who knew tomorrow might be their last day on earth. But they slept soundly because they'd done their job. They'd held the line. At dawn, on day 2, Xerxes made his next move. He unleashed the Immortals. When the sun rose on the second day, the pass at Thermopylae was already thick with the stench of yesterday's slaughter. Flies buzzed over the corpses. Wounded men groaned in the pre-dawn darkness. The Spartans stood at their position, shields already locked, waiting for what they knew was coming. Xerxes had been humiliated. His subject peoples, the Medes and Scythians, had been butchered by a tiny force of Greeks. Now it was time to send in the elite. The Immortals, the emperor's personal bodyguard, 10,000 strong, began their march toward the pass. These weren't conscripts or subject warriors. These were professionals. They'd trained their entire lives for war. They wore scale armor that covered them from neck to knee. They carried spears, swords, and bows. They could fight at range or up close. They could shoot arrows while advancing, then switch to melee in seconds. They were the finest warriors the Persian Empire could produce. The immortals entered the pass with confidence. They'd heard about yesterday's disaster, but they didn't believe a handful of Greeks could stop them. They were the elite. They'd crushed rebellions from India to Egypt. A few hundred Spartans in a narrow pass? This would be over by noon. They were wrong. The immortals advanced in good order, shields up, spears ready. When they got within range, they began loosing arrows. The Greeks ducked behind their shields, let the arrows clatter off the bronze, and waited. The immortals kept coming, stepping over the corpses from yesterday, expecting the Greeks to break and run at any moment. When the immortals hit the shield wall, they discovered what the Medes had learned the hard way. The Greek phalanx wasn't just a defensive formation, it was a killing machine. The longer spears stabbed over and around the shields. The tight formation meant every Greek warrior was supported by the men behind him, adding their weight to each push and shove. But the immortals were better trained than yesterday's troops. They didn't panic and run when the first ranks fell. They stepped over their dead brothers and kept fighting. They tried to find gaps in the Greek line, probing for weaknesses. They fought with skill and courage, and they died anyway. Leonidas had a trick up his sleeve. He'd studied Persian tactics. He knew they weren't used to fighting in tight formation, so he ordered his men to do something that looked insane. In the middle of the fight, the Spartans would suddenly turn and run. The Persians, seeing the Greeks retreat, would break formation and chase them, thinking victory was at hand. Then the Spartans would spin around, reform their line in seconds, and catch the pursuing Persians completely out of position. The immortals would suddenly find themselves bunched up, tripping over each other, unable to use their shields effectively, and the Spartan spears would go to work. It was a false retreat, one of the oldest tricks in warfare, and it worked perfectly. The disciplined Persians fell for it again and again because they couldn't believe the Greeks would run and then come back. The psychological whiplash was devastating. You think you're winning, you break ranks to pursue, and suddenly you're being slaughtered. Herodotus, writing 50 years after the battle, described the carnage in detail. He wrote that the immortals fell in heaps in front of the Greek line. He noted that Xerxes, watching from his throne, again leaped to his feet in terror, convinced his finest troops were being destroyed. Hour after hour, the immortals fed themselves into the meat grinder. They fought with courage and skill, but courage and skill weren't enough. The terrain favored the Greeks. The equipment favored the Greeks. The tactics favored the Greeks. By late afternoon, the immortals had achieved nothing except proving they could die as easily as anyone else. As the sun began to set on day 2, Xerxes faced a terrible reality. He'd sent his best troops into that pass, and they'd been stopped cold. The Greeks had now held for 2 full days. They'd killed thousands of his men, and they showed no signs of breaking. The emperor of Persia, the king of kings, was being humiliated by 300 Spartans. The greatest army ever assembled couldn't break through a pass defended by a force they outnumbered 1,000 to 1. It was the kind of military disaster that destroys reputations and topples dynasties. That night, Xerxes was desperate. He needed a solution, and he needed it fast. His army's morale was crumbling. His generals were whispering. The subject peoples who made up most of his force were starting to wonder if the Persians were actually invincible after all. If a handful of Greeks could do this, maybe rebellion wasn't suicide. Maybe the empire could bleed. Xerxes needed the pass. He needed to crush these Greeks and march south to burn Athens. He needed to show the world that defying Persia was death. But he couldn't break through. Not from the front. Not with 1,000,000 men. That's when treachery entered the story. A local Greek named Ephialtes came to the Persian camp. He was a man from the region around Thermopylae, someone who knew the land intimately. He came bearing a gift that would change everything: information. Ephialtes told Xerxes about the Oenopeia Path, a narrow mountain trail that wound through the hills above Thermopylae and came out behind the Greek position. It was a shepherd's track, barely wide enough for men to walk single file. unknown to outsiders, but common knowledge to locals. For a price, Ephialtes would guide the Persians along this path. He would lead them around the impregnable Greek position and deliver them to the Greek rear. Xerxes rewarded Ephialtes richly. In Greek culture, Ephialtes' name became synonymous with traitor, a curse word that lasted centuries. But to Xerxes, this collaborator was a savior. The emperor immediately ordered Hydarnes, the commander of the immortals, to take his best men and follow Ephialtes through the mountain pass under cover of darkness. At sunset on day 2, while the Greeks tended their wounded and prepared for day 3, 10,000 immortals began climbing into the mountains. They moved quietly, trying not to alert the defenders. But Leonidas wasn't stupid. He knew about the Anapaea path. He'd stationed 1,000 Phocian Greeks at the top of the trail, specifically to guard against this possibility. The Phocians were local militia, not professional warriors like the Spartans. They were brave men defending their homeland, but they weren't ready for what was about to happen. In the dead of night, they heard a rustling sound in the forest. Footsteps. Thousands of them. The immortals were coming. The Phocians scrambled to form a defensive line, but they were outnumbered 10-1 and caught completely by surprise. The immortals didn't even stop to fight them. Hydarnes simply ordered his archers to shower the Phocians with arrows while his main force marched past. The Phocians retreated into the rocks, unable to stop the flood of Persian troops. As dawn broke on day 3, a runner came sprinting down from the mountains to the Greek camp. He brought devastating news. The Persians were behind them. The trap had been sprung in reverse. The defenders were now surrounded. Leonidas called an immediate council of war. His allies argued about what to do. Some wanted to retreat immediately, to escape the encirclement while there was still time. Others wanted to stay and fight. The debate grew heated. These were the final moments of decision, the point where heroes are separated from survivors. Leonidas made the choice for them. He ordered the allies to withdraw. The Thespians and Thebans could leave, save themselves, live to fight another day. The main Greek army would need them in the battles to come. This wasn't cowardice. This was strategy. Why sacrifice 7,000 men when 300 could do the job? Most of the allies took him up on the offer. They gathered their equipment and marched south, escaping before the Persian encirclement closed. But not everyone left. The 700 Thespians refused to abandon the Spartans. Their commander, Demophilus, said they would stay and die alongside Leonidas. It was a gesture of solidarity that Greeks would remember for generations. The 400 Thebans also stayed, though historians debate whether they wanted to or were forced to remain. Some ancient sources claim Leonidas held them as hostages to ensure Thebes' good behavior. Others say they chose to stay. The truth died with them. So, as the sun rose on the third day, approximately 1,100 Greeks remained at Thermopylae. 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans. They knew the Persians were coming from both directions. They knew escape was impossible. They knew this was the end. Leonidas didn't give a dramatic speech. He didn't need to. Every man standing there knew what was about to happen. Instead, the Spartan king gave his men a simple order. Eat a good breakfast, boys. Tonight, we dine in Hades. They ate. They cleaned their weapons one last time. They combed their hair. And then they did something that shocked the Persian scouts who were watching. Instead of waiting behind their defensive wall, the Spartans marched out into the open ground. They were done defending. For their final act, they would attack. The math had stopped making sense. 1,100 men were advancing toward hundreds of thousands. But the Spartans weren't marching to victory. They were marching to legend. When the Spartans marched out of the narrow pass into the wider ground beyond, they were abandoning the tactical advantage that had kept them alive for 2 days. They were giving up the terrain that had nullified Persian numbers. They were choosing to die in the open, where the enemy could surround them, where the odds were impossible. But there was method in this madness. Leonidas understood psychology. He knew his death was inevitable, but he could control how he died. If the Spartans stayed in the pass and waited to be crushed between 2 Persian armies, it would look like they'd been trapped and killed. But if they marched out and attacked, if they died advancing rather than retreating, that would be remembered differently. The Spartans formed their phalanx in the open ground, shields locked, spears leveled. and they began to advance toward the main Persian army. The sun was fully up now, glinting off their bronze armor, turning them into a moving wall of light. The flutes began to play. That haunting, methodical music that had preceded 2 days of slaughter. The Persians couldn't believe what they were seeing. These Greeks, surrounded and doomed, were attacking. Xerxes ordered his troops forward. Fresh divisions of Medes, Scythians, and Immortals poured into the expanded battlefield. They came from the front. They began circling to the flanks. The anvil was closing. The fighting that followed was beyond brutal. It was apocalyptic. The Spartans crashed into the Persian front line like a bronze battering ram. Their longer spears punched through Persian shields and armor. Their discipline held, even as men fell around them. They killed with mechanical efficiency, every thrust calculated, every step coordinated. But now, the Persians could use their numbers. They wrapped around the Greek flanks. They shot arrows from all directions. The 1,100 Greeks found themselves fighting in a circle, shields facing outward, protecting each other's backs. It was the last stand formation, the position you take when you know death is coming and you just want to take as many enemies with you as possible. Leonidas fought in the front rank. Greek kings didn't command from the rear. They led from the front, and they died there too. The Spartan king's spear shattered early in the fight. He drew his sword and kept fighting. He killed dozens of Persians personally before a javelin found the gap in his armor and punched into his chest. The king of Sparta fell, but the battle didn't end. His bodyguards fought over his corpse like lions over a kill. The Persians wanted the body, wanted to parade it as a trophy. The Spartans refused to yield an inch. The fighting over Leonidas's corpse became a battle within a battle, a vicious melee where men fought with swords, spears, teeth, and bare hands. The Persians pushed forward. The Greeks pushed back. 4 times the Spartans drove the enemy away from their fallen king. 4 times the Persians regrouped and charged again. The ground became slick with blood. Men slipped and fell and were trampled. The dying screamed. The wounded fought on. Then the Persians coming from behind, the Immortals who'd taken the mountain path, arrived at the battlefield. Now the Greeks were truly surrounded. Persian troops stretched in every direction, thousands deep. The circle of bronze shields grew smaller with every passing minute. The Spartan spears broke. They drew their swords. Their swords shattered from the force of the blows. They fought with broken spear shafts, using the bronze butt spikes to stab at enemy faces. When those broke, they used their shields as weapons, smashing the heavy bronze edges into skulls and necks. When their shields splintered, they fought with their fists and teeth. Herodotus recorded that some Spartans killed Persians with their bare hands in those final moments. They were beyond weapons, beyond tactics, beyond anything resembling organized warfare. They were pure violence, the human animal fighting for survival against impossible odds. The Persians didn't break through the Greek circle. They buried it. Wave after wave of Persian troops crashed over the defenders, like a tsunami. Arrows fell like rain, so thick that the air itself seemed to turn solid. The Spartans died standing, shields locked even as the life left their bodies, held upright by the press of corpses around them. By the time the sun reached its peak, the last Greek at Thermopylae was dead. 1,100 men had been completely annihilated, but they'd extracted a terrible price. The ground was carpeted with Persian bodies. Estimates vary, but ancient sources put Persian casualties over the 3 days at 20,000 men. Modern historians think the real number was probably lower, maybe 10,000. But even 10,000 dead to kill 1,100 defenders is a catastrophic exchange ratio. Xerxes, looking at the battlefield, was not satisfied. He'd won, yes, but at what cost? He'd lost 20,000 men, including many of his best immortals. He'd been delayed for 3 days. He'd proven that Greek hoplites, properly positioned and properly led, could slaughter Persian troops like sheep. Every subject people in his empire had just learned that the invincible Persians could be beaten. The emperor did something that shocked his own men. He ordered Leonidas's body found, beheaded, and crucified. It was an act of petty revenge, a violation of the customs of war. Normally, enemies treated fallen warriors with respect. But Xerxes was so enraged by what this Spartan king had done to him that he wanted even his corpse humiliated. It backfired spectacularly. The crucifixion of Leonidas didn't intimidate the Greeks. it enraged them. It turned Leonidas from a king into a martyr, from a warrior into a symbol. Every Greek who heard what Xerxes had done to the Spartan king's body felt their blood boil. The Persian army marched south through the pass they'd paid so dearly to take. They continued toward Athens, burning everything in their path. When they reached the city, they found it empty. Themistocles had convinced the Athenians to evacuate. The Persians burned the abandoned city to the ground, destroying the temples, smashing the statues, turning the cradle of democracy into ash. Xerxes thought he'd won. He'd destroyed Athens. He'd killed Leonidas. He'd proven Persian power. But he'd actually lost. He just didn't know it yet. Because while the Persians celebrated, the Greeks were gathering. The 3 days Leonidas bought hadn't just allowed the Greek army to assemble. They'd given the Greek navy time to prepare. And at a narrow strait called Salamis, Themistocles was about to spring a trap that would shatter the Persian fleet. But that's another story. For now, we need to understand what happened at Thermopylae and why it mattered. The immediate military impact of Thermopylae was minimal. The Persians won. They took the pass. They killed all the defenders. They marched on and burned Athens. In the short term, it looked like a Persian victory. But the long-term impact was seismic. The 300 Spartans became a legend before the bodies were even cold. Stories spread through Greece like wildfire. A handful of free men had held back an empire. They'd fought to the last man. They'd shown that Persians could be killed, that Persian armies could be stopped, that Persian arrogance could be humbled. When the main Greek army finally assembled, they weren't fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting to avenge Thermopylae. They were fighting to prove that Leonidas hadn't died for nothing. That motivation turned out to be incredibly powerful. At Salamis, just weeks after Thermopylae, the Greek navy destroyed the Persian fleet. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore as 300 Greek ships shattered 600 Persian vessels in the narrow straits. It was Thermopylae in reverse. The Persians trapped in a confined space, unable to use their numbers, butchered by a smaller force, using better tactics. The following year, at Plataea, the Greek armies met the Persian land forces in open battle. 100,000 Greeks faced 300,000 Persians and allies. The Greeks won decisively, killing the Persian commander and routing the army. The invasion was over. The Persian Empire retreated back to Asia and never seriously threatened mainland Greece again. Those victories at Salamis and Plataea don't happen without Thermopylae. The 3 days bought by Leonidas gave Greece time to organize. The sacrifice of the 300 gave the Greeks a rallying cry, a proof that they could win. It transformed the war from a hopeless defense against impossible odds into a crusade. The Greeks erected a memorial at Thermopylae. It's still there, 25 centuries later. A stone lion marks the spot where Leonidas fell, and carved into the stone is an epitaph written by the poet Simonides. It's the most famous war memorial in history. 7 words in Greek that translate to, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." That epitaph captures the essence of Sparta. These men didn't die because they were trapped. They died because their laws required it. They died because their society had raised them to believe that courage was the highest virtue, that death in battle was the finest fate, that running from overwhelming odds was worse than dying to face them. Modern people sometimes misunderstand what the Spartans were. We romanticize them, turn them into superheroes, imagine them as noble warriors fighting for freedom. The reality is more complex and darker. Sparta was a militaristic slave state. The Spartans could focus entirely on warfare because they enslaved a population called helots to do all the farming and labor. They treated the helots with shocking brutality, periodically culling them to prevent rebellion. Spartan society was built on violence and fear. Boys were beaten and starved to make them tough. Weak infants were supposedly left on hillsides to die. The entire culture was organized around producing warriors who would never, ever run from battle. It was effective, but it wasn't nice. Yet at Thermopylae, that harsh system produced men who did something extraordinary. They stood in front of an empire and refused to move. They sacrificed themselves, knowing it would buy their civilization a few more days. In that moment, whatever darkness lurked in Spartan society was redeemed by an act of pure courage. The battle also revealed something about military tactics that military historians still study today. Thermopylae proved that terrain multiplies force. A small number of well-equipped, well-trained soldiers defending favorable ground can defeat vastly larger armies. This lesson would be relearned throughout history, from Agincourt to Stalingrad. It proved that morale matters more than numbers. The Persian army had every advantage except one. They didn't really believe in their cause. They were fighting because their emperor commanded it. The Greeks were fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. That difference in motivation turned out to be decisive. It proved that new military technologies don't automatically win wars. The Persians had larger armies, better logistics, more resources, superior cavalry. But the Greek hoplite phalanx, a relatively simple tactical system, beat all of it through discipline and technique. The legacy of Thermopylae extends far beyond ancient Greece. Every underdog story for the next 2 millennia draws on this template. Outnumbered defenders, impossible odds. A narrow position that neutralizes enemy advantages. A sacrifice that buys time for others. The Alamo in 1836, where 200 Texans held off 5,000 Mexicans. Rorke's Drift in 1879, where 150 British soldiers fought off 4,000 Zulu warriors. These stories consciously evoke Thermopylae. The defenders at both battles knew the story. They saw themselves as modern Spartans. That's the power of a legend properly told. But there's a danger in romanticizing Thermopylae too much. We need to remember that this was a real battle with real consequences. 1,100 men died horrible deaths. They weren't abstract heroes. They were husbands and fathers and sons who bled and screamed and died in agony. Many of them probably regretted their choice in those final moments, when the spears punched through their armor and the darkness closed in. War is not glorious. War is not noble. War is young men dying in mud and blood, while old men watch from hilltops. Thermopylae reminds us that sometimes war is necessary, that sometimes people need to fight and die to protect what they love. But it should never make us forget that war is always tragic. The real miracle of Thermopylae isn't that the 300 held out for 3 days. The miracle is that their sacrifice mattered. They died, but their civilization survived. They lost the battle, but their side won the war. They bought 3 days with their lives, and those 3 days changed the course of human history. If Leonidas had retreated, if he'd decided discretion was the better part of valor, Greece would have fallen. The Persian Empire would have conquered Europe. There would be no classical Athens, no Socrates, or Plato, or Aristotle, no democracy, no theater, no philosophy. Western civilization as we know it would not exist. The modern world speaks English, French, Spanish, languages descended from Greek and Latin. We organize our governments based on Greek and Roman models. Our art, architecture, literature, science, all of it traces back through Rome to Greece. And Greece survived because 300 Spartans planted their feet in a narrow pass and refused to move. It's humbling to realize how fragile history actually is. How many times has civilization been saved by a handful of people making the right choice at the right moment? How many times have we come within a hair's breadth of a completely different timeline? Thermopylae is one of those hinge points, the battle where the future of the world balanced on the edge of a sword, and a group of hard men from a small, brutal city-state held the line just long enough to tip the balance. Standing at Thermopylae today, looking at the stone monument to the fallen, you can still feel the weight of what happened here. The pass has changed. The sea has receded. The hot springs still bubble up from the earth, but the landscape is different. Modern roads cut through where ancient warriors bled, but the memory persists. The lesson endures. When faced with impossible odds, when the experts say there's no hope, when retreat seems like the only rational choice, sometimes the right answer is to plant your feet and fight. Not because you'll win. You probably won't. But because some things are worth dying for. Some lines cannot be crossed. Some stands must be made. Leonidas and his 300 made that stand. They chose death over dishonor. They chose their laws over their lives. They chose the hard right over the easy wrong. And 25 centuries later, we still remember their names. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. They did their duty. They held the line. They bought time for civilization itself. And in doing so, they became immortal. The Persian Empire eventually fell. Xerxes was assassinated by his own bodyguard. The vast domains he ruled fragmented and collapsed. But Sparta endured. Greece endured. Western civilization endured. Because on a hot August morning, in 480 BC, 300 men decided that some things are worth more than life itself. That is the legacy of Thermopylae. Not tactics or strategy, though both were brilliant. Not equipment or training, though both were superb. The legacy is simpler and more profound. It's the lesson that courage is contagious. That sacrifice matters. That a small group of committed people, fighting for something they believe in, can change the world. The Spartans at Thermopylae were not perfect men. They came from a flawed society with values we would reject today. But in that narrow pass, for 3 days in summer, they did something perfect. They showed the world what humans are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. They proved that flesh and blood and bronze, properly applied, can stop an empire in its tracks. Every soldier who's ever held impossible ground thinks of Thermopylae. Every person who's faced overwhelming odds and refused to quit draws strength from that story. It's embedded in our culture, our literature, our understanding of what heroism means. The 300 Spartans bought Greece 3 days. Those 3 days bought Western civilization its future. And that future bought us the world we live in today. It's a chain of causation stretching across 25 centuries, linking ancient warriors in bronze armor to modern people living in a world they could never have imagined. But they'd understand the core truth. They'd recognize the world they saved, because the values they died for, the ideals they protected, are still here. Freedom, courage, the belief that some things are worth fighting for, the conviction that tyranny must be resisted, no matter the odds. Thermopylae wasn't the end of anything. It was a beginning. The beginning of the Greek Golden Age. The beginning of Western civilization, as we know it. The beginning of the legend that still inspires people to stand up against impossible odds. When you're facing your own Thermopylae, when the world seems too big and the fight seems too hard, remember the 300. Remember that they didn't fight to win. They fought to hold the line. They fought to buy time. They fought because someone had to, and they were there. Sometimes that's all you can do. Plant your feet, lock your shield with your brothers, and hold the line. The victory may come later, won by others who had the time you bought. Or the victory may never come at all, but you'll know you stood. You'll know you fought. You'll know you didn't yield. That's the gift of Thermopylae. Not a template for victory, but a template for heroism. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay when everyone else runs. That sometimes the most important battles are the ones you lose. That sometimes 300 determined people can indeed change the world. The sun set on Thermopylae 25 centuries ago, but the light from that battle still shines, still inspires, still reminds us what humans can accomplish when they refuse to surrender. The 300 Spartans are dust. Their shields and spears corroded away millennia ago, but the story lives on. And as long as people still face impossible odds and still need courage to face them, the story of Thermopylae will never die. They held the line. They bought the time. They saved the world. And that, stranger passing by, is why we still tell their tale.